Our second plenary is a conversation with Janis Bowdler, who is the president of J.P. Morgan Chase & Company Foundation, who in 2018 made a commitment to invest $1.75 billion over the next 5 years to strengthen workforce systems, revitalize neighborhoods, grow small businesses, and improve the financial health of individuals. Janis has spent the last 2 decades advancing economic opportunities for families at risk of being left out of growing global prosperity. She's authored a number of publications on financial opportunity and economic mobility, most recently co-authoring Building Equitable Cities, How to Drive Economic Mobility and Regional Growth. And we want to say a special thank you to J.P. Morgan Chase for providing a copy of Janis's book for everyone who's in attendance at the summit today. So please, let's welcome to the stage Janis Bowdler and Tawanna A.
Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you again for myself and the center, but I would say more than that from our entire region for J.P. Morgan Chase and your investment in the work that we're doing to create an inclusive economy here in our region. And I am particularly excited to have you here as a leader who, as Robin just shared, has not only worked right now leading philanthropic work at J.P. Morgan Chase, but also knows and understands the work from a community perspective of what it takes to be able to build strong partnerships that lead to equity, that lead to wealth building, what it takes to do that not only with nonprofits and communities, what it takes to do that with policymakers, but also what it takes to do that work in a business. And now you're inside that business, and we're going to get an opportunity to be able to talk with each other in a little bit of a fishbowl with the rest of the audience to understand what your journey's been like, what you've experienced, what you've learned along that journey, what you're experiencing at J.P. Morgan Chase, and what view the organization and firm have on communities, what it takes to be able to build strong communities really from the inside out, and why you're so interested now in the Twin Cities market, and what we can do together to continue to build an inclusive economy.
Absolutely.
So tell me first just a little bit about your journey.
Sure. So well, first of all, it's always weird to hear somebody read your bio. I always feel like, my bio is written by my mom or something. It's like it's all the good stuff, right? We only put the good stuff in the bio. No, so I'm from the Midwest. I grew up outside Cleveland, Ohio, and really with an acute understanding of how much place matters. Where I grew up, I lived just a few blocks from a very well-resourced school district, but it was actually not the school district I was zoned for. The school district that I went to and that I grew up in was a much more high-poverty, low-resource school. So thank you, grad school. I now have a term of geography of opportunity. That's not one I understood or I had as a kid, but I grew up fundamentally understanding how much place matters. And that's been a driving motivator for me throughout my career, really thinking about cities and place. That eventually took me to DC, to National Council of La Raza, now Unidos US, which really was my dream job, to be able to advocate on behalf of my community at the national level and think about really long-lasting financial security and resiliency through asset building. And so I did that work for 10 years after spending some time working in Cleveland. And I got approached by J.P. Morgan Chase when they were at this really pivotal moment of trying to change the way the firm was thinking about corporate philanthropy. And I've shared this story before. When I first sat down, I thought, I don't know. I don't know if you guys are really serious about this. And I quickly got excited by the opportunity to rethink the way a corporation could put out not just dollars, because quite frankly, anybody can put out dollars, but how could we use the platform and the full resources of the firm to drive social change, things that I'd been spending my entire career thinking about. And that opportunity was really exciting. It's been 6 years. We wasted no time, got right to work, and it's been a journey the entire time. I can talk more about the kind of how we've shaped that work, but that's what really brought me to J.P. Morgan Chase.
It's an exciting journey, and one that we see not a whole lot of leaders who make the transitions from one sector to another, either nonprofits into the private sector or government into nonprofits or philanthropy. and yet one that I think is really critical for more people to be moving in between the sectors so that we have that infiltration of knowledge, but also so we find some spaces where we have commonality. And I heard you use the phrase of saying, okay, when I was at National Council, Raza, we had a focus on assets and wealth building, which isn't something everybody might know. And then you think about going into a bank where clearly there's a focus on assets and wealth building and the ability to draw those through lines. For the audience, for folks who are less familiar with the organization you were in before JP Morgan Chase, can you draw us the through line that you see between community-based organizations, particularly in communities of color, that are doing work every day, but whose narrative may not always make that leap over to the private sector?
Sure. So actually, that's a great question. I want to answer that. Your point about moving around. So early in my career, when I looked at the women who were 15 and 20 years ahead of me that I thought were most influential at driving change, they had this three-legged stool. They had been in the public sector, they had done government, they'd been in the nonprofit sector, and they've been in corporate. And I realized like their ability to move in between these spaces and to hold a big table is actually why they were so influential. So I think it's really incredible because the challenges that we're taking on are not ones that are going to be solved by any sector alone. They're going to be solved when we all work together. So having that ability, like you've done as well, to kind of move in between those places and understand each other's language becomes really incredible, to be real partners. So my work at Unidos US, and can I shout out, is Ruby here? Ruby Lee from Clues? Where are you? Ruby? She was, okay. Somebody tell Ruby I said hi. As they're an Unidos US affiliate, or if anybody's from Clues is here. So when I started working there, first of all, we just had, as I think as a broad field, made this shift. There had been a lot of focus on income inequality and how we really increase incomes for individuals. But then we realized that's really only one part of the picture of the broader gender and racial wealth divide. And that when we just focused on income, that during the downturn, the inevitable recession or an inevitable family hardship, people did not have the financial resiliency that really come with assets. And so your wealth is just your assets minus your liabilities. And for most people and most white people, their wealth comes from intergenerational transfer, intergenerational wealth transfer. I won't make you all repeat it 3 times fast, but that basically means the money you got from your parents. And so we can see the legacy of the racial wealth gap when, over a period of generations, families that don't have a lot to pass to their children, in fact, their children are constantly, from a wealth perspective, starting out at a deficit. That means their parents can't necessarily put money in for, help them with their down payment, pay for their school. They don't have a nest egg to draw on during a time of financial hardship. And that's really not only constantly setting them behind, but they're taking on more debt and often taking care of their parents.
Absolutely.
So that was my work, was focusing on that, particularly from the Latino perspective. And then the chance at JP Morgan Chase to say, this is integral to what a bank does from a set of products, but often we see a mismatch where the bank's not actually able to get to the communities that it says that it wants to serve. So we can think about philanthropy through a last mile strategy, and increasingly we can think about how the bank can do more, so we start to close that gap between the work that philanthropy does and where the bank meets their customers where they are.
And the bank has been taking on really, I think, compelling work that many of us have been able to watch throughout the media. In some ways, if we think about the Advancing Cities Challenge that your organization just put forward, but then also doing a lot of deep work first that is probably behind the scenes for many, but for several years to look inside and say, how are we solving for economic inclusion? How are we solving for wealth building and income and closing gaps inside before we go, or at least alongside our efforts that are externally? Can you take us along that journey? And in particular, one of the things that we talked about that I'm struck by is the need for our stories to not only tell the successes, but the challenge points, because none of this work is easy. None of it happens overnight. We don't change organizational culture overnight or even policies. And so having an organization who's lived a pretty public-facing life in the industry that your firm is in. What's the journey been like?
So first of all, I think it all starts at the top in a basic orientation. So the orientation to our work as a firm and for corporate responsibility specifically is around inclusive economic growth. And our investment strategy, our corporate responsibility investment strategy is in 4 key drivers of economic opportunity: jobs and skills, financial health, small business, and community development. And if I can just brag on myself and my team, where's Owen over here? Owen leads all of our grant making here in Minnesota and several other markets across the Midwest. We have spent the last 5 years really building out these strategies, innovating, understanding all the levers that we can pull to make that change happen in communities. And if I, again, shamelessly plug our corporate responsibility report, which you guys can find online with a simple Google, you'll see we're reporting out those impact numbers. So that's great. And we've spent the last 5 years doing that. Happy to talk more about it. You can't keep doing that work and talk about how awesome it is for too long before somebody says, oh, right, you're advising everybody else on how to prepare as an employer's jobs of the future, but you employ 250,000 people. What are you doing as an employer? You can't go out and talk about how you're supporting the financial health of communities as a bank and not talk about the way your products are responsive or what you're doing to support the financial health of those 250,000 employees. So that's really been then our success in our corporate responsibility work has really then been a lever to have a more strategic conversation internally about what are we doing, and are we doing it with the same passion and drive for excellence that we do anything else on any product line or in our corporate responsibility. So that has really kind of changed the conversation and the way we talk about these internally, because one, we've built up some extra expertise, but two, I think we just can't credibly go out into the communities and tell others how they should do it if we're not also trying to do these things ourselves.
Absolutely. I'm drawn to the kind of multifaceted intersectional approach of that. Of course, it's what we believe in at the center. At the same time, I'm drawn to a nugget that I caught you say there, the importance of focusing on the financial health of your own employees. And when we think about the indicators we shared earlier this morning, one of the key indicators that we're drawing attention to, and I think it was number 3, when we asked the audience to give us poll feedback about the areas they thought we should prioritize, was working poverty. The number of people who are in our communities who go to work every day, who put their best foot forward, and yet are not just not thriving, they're still struggling to make it out of poverty. And the numbers in that indicators report, as those of you start to pour through those numbers, I think the number is just under $40,000 for a family of, it says 2.5, but 2.5 means 3 people, right? And so we think about how families are struggling, and we're talking to employers in our market about the need to understand your workforce, the need to know how many people on my workforce might be housing cost burdened, might even be homeless as a result of being housing cost burdened, or other barriers to wealth and thriving financially. How do you think about, as you think about not only your experience today, but your journey, what have you seen that works for employers to really take that onus seriously?
So first of all, I think the direction that the financial health field is going is really working hand in glove with employers. I'm sure in this room as well, we've worked with a number of organizations that are based here in Minneapolis and St. Paul in the Twin Cities area on financial coaching, how you do deep work with individuals. In my mind, gone are the days where we just simply hand somebody a budget and lecture them on doing better. People's lives are dynamic, their income and expenses cash flow is dynamic, and they need the same kind of financial coaching that people with means pay for, right? Like, poor people are actually really savvy with their money. That's not the issue. The issue is the challenges of daily life. So one of those includes, it can be really challenging for working individuals, especially if you think about maybe our target population, working 1, maybe 2 jobs, limited access to childcare, really difficult to get across town to a community organization for financial coaching. If we can take those strategies to employers and kind of meet people where they are, then we've got a win-win. We know that supporting employees financially can often reduce turnover unnecessarily, strengthen the bond between employee and employer. So that's a growing strategy in the field and one that we're supporting. For us, I mean, back to holding up the mirror, I think we were shocked to find out during a couple of different weather-related disasters, right? We go out to first to make sure employees are okay, and finding out that a couple of our employees didn't have bank accounts, or maybe were living in their cars. And you just intuit, like, oh, you work at a bank, like clearly you must know these things, but why? Actually, like only, probably 50% of our company is a tech company, not bankers at all. And so we started getting really serious about how can we support financial wellness and think about it in the same way we think about physical wellness and approach it with the same kind of perspective.
I love that thought of how we take what we know in an industry where we've had proven success. We've been purposeful about health and wellness. We've been intentional about our strategies. We've measured them, and so now we have some success. How do we take those lessons learned and apply it somewhere else? So can you talk to us a little bit about the major strategies that are happening inside your organization right now, advancing Black pathways, the challenge you put out to cities to really get creative and innovative in the way that they partner to take on economic challenges?
Yes.
What's happening at JP Morgan Chase?
Oh my gosh, there's so much. So again, I'm gonna send you guys to the corporate responsibility report. It just came out. There's a lot in there, including reporting out our impact data, which I think is really, really important, both from accountability, but also learning. I mean, we want to be active learners with all of you and all of our communities because we're constantly iterating together on how we tackle these challenges. So you'll get a flavor. You mentioned two specifically, so I will kind of talk about advancing cities, and then I can talk about advancing Black pathways and women on the move. So taking them separately, the Advancing Cities Challenge, and maybe some of you saw the RFP that came out early this year, and we just announced our inaugural 5 winners, really was an evolution of our work. I mentioned our 4 drivers of economic opportunity that we focus on, and we've really spent the last 5 years thinking about systems level change, innovation within each one of those areas. Okay, now I'm gonna flash your materials because I'm totally obsessed with this, which I know you guys talked about earlier, and I'm like ready to frame on my bulletin board in my office. You can't address regional, racial, and gender wealth divide. You can't really drive an inclusive economy unless all these things are coming together. And that's what we really saw, where we could be doing great innovative work in each one of these areas, but if they're not intersecting with each other, if our 4 drivers are not also connecting with the health sector or the public education sector, then we're not really going to move the needle for a city or region. At the same time, in order to do that, I don't have to tell you guys working in a regional economy, it takes a lot of collaboration to make that happen. And so the Advancing Cities competition was this idea of how can we really support collaboration specifically to drive a cross-city, multi-sector collaboration for the intentions of inclusive economic growth, with a specific eye towards how are we closing racial disparities and gender disparities. So that, we found that the competition model really unearths a lot of innovation, but we really also wanted to prioritize where have the leadership of different communities coalesced around a shared understanding of the problem, and now they're rallying around a shared vision of the future, and we can help accelerate that work. So that's the Advancing Cities Challenge. The Advancing Black Pathways and Women on the Move, so those are announcements that we've made in the previous 6 months or so. Both of these are business-led efforts. They are an opportunity where the bank has stepped up and said, we want to be the best bank and the best employer for, in this case, for Black Americans and for women globally. We've also formed a Hispanic Executive Council, an Asian Executive Council, and an LGBT Leadership Council. And so these are mechanisms for us to focus from top to bottom. How are we bringing more young people in to as interns, analysts, and associates, but also how are we advancing people all the way up through the pipeline, moving from VP, ED, and MD, that's our internal hierarchy. How do we make sure that our products and services are oriented to the needs of the community, and how are we supporting those communities broadly? What I'm most proud of, in particular with advancing Black pathways and women on the move, is these are not corporate responsibility-led efforts. They're embedded in the business. And so, our work features heavily. We clearly are close collaborators. But the fact that our business leadership is saying this is critical to the success of my organization just puts that much more emphasis on the work.
We know that it takes that, having business line leaders in every division, but particularly those that historically have been left out of leadership, at least at the diversity and inclusion table, really saying not only is this important to me personally, it's important for my division.
Right.
And I want to see results. I'm going to help create an environment that drives toward results, and not only those kind of what effort did we put forward. We can have positive effort sometimes, but at some point we need to say, okay, did that positive effort turn into results? What's it been like trying to create a culture of results inside the organization?
So, at least for JP Morgan Chase, I can say, what's the adage? What gets measured is what gets done. So once, if you guys ever get the chance to meet Jamie Dimon, I can tell you, once he focuses on something, look out, that's a thing that's going to get done. And so I think some of the, it's the same for our corporate responsibility work. Once we got everybody really excited about the depth of work that we were doing, people were like, okay, great, results. And then we had to kind of backtrack a little bit and say, well, some of this stuff takes time, and how are we going to measure our results in the interim? I shared with you that after getting one executive particularly excited about what we were doing, he was like, great, so when will we achieve equity? And I was like, oh, that is an excellent question, sir. We can unpack that. But, so for my work, we are constantly trying to understand what we're achieving with our dollars, trying to put that back out, both for accountability, but also with some humility, because we're constantly learning, and the work that we're all doing is changing real time under our feet. For some of our internal initiatives around where we're hiring, I think this is one of those things that sat out there for a while, where we made big statements. We want to do better. We want more diverse leadership at the top. We want, and it just kind of hung out there. But until somebody got specific and started measuring it, it was very amorphous. And I think that really changed the conversation internally. And it was a combination of, honestly, employees standing up and saying, this is really important to me, managers and allies who said, I can't attract the best talent because we're not known as being a place that's inclusive. How do we change that perception so that we're able to recruit the best talent, and tackling the problem from a number of different sides? And then you start measuring it, and then you start to see the results. Once people know they're accountable to the big boss, then people pay attention.
Absolutely, and seeing that accountability driven from a perspective about the business, that we need this talent, we're losing talent because we haven't created the culture, we're losing talent because we don't have the brand of not just being supportive of diversity and inclusion, but we don't have a brand of being equitable, of being inclusive, and that people know they're wanted here.
Right.
That means people will step up to the plate.
Right, that they'll have a long runway on their career. And some of the major steps, diversifying our board. We added 2 African American individuals to our board over the last year and a half. Our operating committee, which is all of Jamie Dimon's direct reports, is 50% women. Also, I think there's the attack it from the ground and what's our pipeline, and then there's making also big, bold leadership moves that help create the space for all that really important work that happens in the middle.
Absolutely. So we're here, and we can think of a million reasons why you might choose to be investing more deeply in the Twin Cities market, knowing JP Morgan Chase has been investing in this market for some time. But can you talk to us about what you see in our market that makes you say, we want to be partnering with organizations, with other leaders and businesses here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the region, and then in particular with the center, with the mission that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a firm, we're expanding here. We're really excited to bring our retail branch network to the city. We already have over 1 million customers that are here. I think I'm going to get the number wrong, 20 to 21,000 small business customers that are here already. And so a retail branch network seems obvious. It's a chance to deepen our relationship with customers. But I think what's really exciting about that is that allows us to bring more of the levers of the firm to a place that is dynamic and growing. And I think really excited by what I've seen here already in the market, spending time with you all, seeing the work that CEI is doing to really, going back to what I said earlier, create that collaborative table for moving an inclusive agenda forward. I mean, you have got so many ripe opportunities here, thinking about, I know there's a conversation this afternoon around supplier diversity. You know, this being home to so many Fortune 500 companies, you have a chance to really line up the small business work that CEI is doing and some other folks. I know Gary's going to join us on stage. I know there are a number of other really great organizations in town. Line that up with the purchasing power of those entities. A ton of other good work that's going on here, but all of that makes me really excited to see, you know, what we can do together.
Absolutely. Well, we're looking forward to continuing the partnership long into the future. And now I think is a good time to transition and welcome up our panelists who are going to join and be hosted and emceed by our very own RYBAK from the Minneapolis Foundation. Gary Cunningham, the CEO and president of Meda, is joining us, as is Commissioner Steve Grove from DEED is joining us one more time on stage, and Commissioner Nora Slawick from Met Council is joining us for a great conversation. Let's give it up for them as they join us here on stage.
Well, thanks everybody. That was really terrific. You know, one of the things that I wanted to pivot off of is Janis did a really good job of putting herself into the work and her place and connecting that to place. So I'm wondering if we could maybe start by each of you talking a little bit about how you grew up really brings you to this connection to place. Personally, I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in southwest Minneapolis, went on a scholarship to a private school where people had a lot more money. My parents had a drugstore where the customers had a lot less money. Our drugstore primarily served African Americans, so I was dependent on African Americans as a white person for our income, which changed that. All of it connected to wanting to heal all of that together and understand what I would later think is continuum of privilege. Talk about your own work, if you would, on, you want to start, Nora, with doing that and give us a sense of why is Nora doing what she's doing because of what she grew up as?
Well, mine's a little bit unusual, right? And I grew up in Tucson, so 60 miles from the border of Mexico. I went to all public schools. I went to a public university. We grew up in a neighborhood that at our school we had both big houses and little houses. You know, when you live in a warm climate, poverty is really visible and you can see it. So we had the whole range of where I grew up and where grew up in the same house my whole childhood. And so I think part of it for me though was that we were all in this together. Yeah. You know, there wasn't a lot of separation. We had a lot of Latino, Hispanic kids in our schools. So that brought me eventually up to Minnesota after college to work for United Way and served 7 terms in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Was the mayor of Maplewood for 2 terms, and now I'm the chair of the Met Council, right? So, but it all started back then. And my dad was an insurance salesman, and my mom sold real estate. But they were always, was always caring about other people. I have to tell you, when I grew up, Minnesota was like this mythical land to us. We actually did not, really, because we saw California as sort of the great place to be. But I think that all those experiences brought that to me where I'm at, and are helping at the Met Council.
Cool. Yeah. Gary. Go ahead, Gary, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I grew up here in Minneapolis, both North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis. Single-parent household, but a great place to grow up in. At the same time, it was a very segregated community. So you had South Minneapolis where there was African-American population in North Minneapolis. And I think, you know, now in hindsight, it's clear that was by design. It wasn't accidental that I ended up growing up in a segregated neighborhood. The experiences I had, I remember going into the first integrated school, which was Greeley School in South Minneapolis. And the first day of class, I got the kids lined up to punch me because I was African American in a row. And then the teacher came back into the classroom and I said I was crying, et cetera. And she said, oh, no, none of that happened. So this is kind of the reality that African Americans and other people of color have faced in these structures and systems that maintain unequal outcomes for us.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Gary. Steve.
It's really powerful. I grew up in Northfield, Minnesota, about an hour south of here. And Northfield wasn't a particularly diverse town growing up. But when I came back for a brief window after college, it had become slightly more diverse, primarily due to the influx of Hispanic immigration in Northfield. A lot of meatpacking plants nearby and other agrarian jobs made Northfield go from sort of about 1% Hispanic to about 10%. And my first job back in Northfield when I finished college was writing for my local paper, and one of the first issues that we tackled was what is happening to our town as it becomes more diverse with this new landscape for our demography in Northfield. And there was a lot of tension in terms of housing and schooling and language skill. And so that was kind of my first job in journalism, was to write a series of stories about that challenge for Northfield. I then left actually for a couple of decades and just came back to Minnesota a year ago to work here. Like all good Minnesotans, found my way back. My wife and I moved to Minneapolis, and we both have really focused on this issue quite a bit. In many ways, her influence has helped shape my views on this issue. She's the daughter of Thai immigrants, and so we have biracial kids and think a lot about these issues in our house, and I think we have this nonprofit we started about 5 or 6 years ago that tries to get students who are from non-traditional backgrounds into careers in technology by giving them some exposure to jobs in tech to get a sense for what it could be like to work in technology. Both of us worked at Google before moving back here. So being from Northfield and feeling an allegiance to the state, but also understanding some of the challenges that our state faces in this area is a part of what I think shapes my new work at Deed.
One of the things that is, I think, important about the way we're approaching this, and I think Janis touched on this as well, is this whole issue of public-private partnerships, which is just a wonderful little connection of words, but it means a lot of different things. I mean, I basically had to learn as mayor, there's not a single thing I can solve on my own. So I have to do this, and I came to like to do this. As you're approaching this, you know, Nora, you've come in and out of, well, you've been primarily in government. How do you look at this, and how do you really see how you disrupt the systems in government or anything else that have been part of a system that has created this incredible inequity?
You know, I think that public-private partnerships are really, really important. You know, it's when we're at the Met Council, we're always looking at when we're doing our transit lines, who are we going to partnership with? You know, it's with Target, it's with Alina, a lot of places that it's about helping people to get to places they need to go, to work, to school, to doctor appointments. And so we find those partnerships work well. It is not always easy to engage, right? You know, in Maplewood, our largest company makes Post-its, right? That little company with 15,000 people that came into Maplewood every day, and it was hard to engage them because they belonged to the big chambers and did, you know, all the things globally and not as much right in our backyard. And so I think, you know, part of our struggles with equity, for example, in Maplewood, we have a huge Hmong population, about 30%, is how to engage people, the families, and how to get people involved with government and with the partners if we can bring them to the table. But it's been somewhat of a struggle sometimes.
Yeah. There you go.
Sure. Well, Meda is a public-private partnership. Our board is made up of corporate members and mid-level businesses. And we have relationships with the state government and the local governments to address issues of economic equality through business development for color. I keep going in and out here. So partly what we're trying to do and the basis on which we're operating from is really that one of the ways that we know we can close the gap between people of color and white people is by creating businesses in the community. In fact, the research nationally shows it's probably one of the only proven ways to do that. And so what we attempt to do, and I think we do it well, is by scaling businesses of color, by providing the resources, the technical assistance, the management education, et cetera, to do that. And we couldn't do that without our corporate partners, many of you who are in the room. We couldn't do that without our foundation partners, including the Minneapolis Foundation. And we couldn't do that without our partners at the state that have provided both capital and technical support in order to change the trajectory. I would argue that unless we figure out a strategy to really address how we build economic power within communities of color, we're not going to move the ball very far. And so at the end of the day, it's going to take all of us working together to change the trajectory of not only this community, but communities across the country. And I'd also say that the workforce and the people at J.P. Morgan Chase, including Janis, have been a huge help to us. Thank you.
Yeah, I think when you look at workforce, not just in the state of Minnesota, but nationally, it's gone under a pretty huge transformation in the last 10 or 20 years. We used to have a system where the employers themselves did the training, which in some ways is ideal, right? You want the businesses who are going to hire the workers to know exactly what they need to train the workers on to get those jobs. But in the economy of today, when people move between jobs so fluidly and so often, the incentives for businesses themselves to take the lion's share of the lift on training has started to evaporate. And so training programs for businesses have declined significantly in the past 10 or 20 years, which means government has to ramp up our efforts to train workers for businesses. So you talk about public-private partnerships, unless us as a state agency focused on workforce development is thinking about the business as our customer and designing our workforce development efforts to produce workers that will match the needs that our business climate has, then we're not going to be very successful. So we've really tried to lean in heavily to that space early to make sure we're hearing from business leaders across the state what they need and tailoring our programs to match those needs. The other way I think about partnerships is something we talked about this morning a little bit more in depth, which is how we partner with nonprofits and other innovative groups trying new solutions for workforce development. Because we sit on top of a system that was built primarily in the 70s and 80s to meet the different needs of a different type of worker at a different time in our state's economy. And the challenges that we face in our state's economy and workforce today, as highlighted really well by this summit and others like it, is how we close the opportunity gap between whites and people of color and make the best of our labor force that we have growing today. And I think the system that's in place now isn't set up for us to be as successful in that realm, and the more we can lean towards partners who are going to try new innovative solutions to get new innovative results, the better off we'll be. So that's why early in our time at DEEB, we've really honed in on this grants area, something we need to get right and get more effectively, so that when we are partnering outside of government, we're doing it really, really effectively and transparently. DEED spends over $300 million a year on workforce development. So this is a lot of capital we're talking about. And if we're not getting the most out of that money, then we're not doing right by the people of Minnesota. So it's partnership is a big focus for us.
Janis, I'm going to bring you into this mix too as we go, if you don't mind. One of the things that's always bothered me is that people will ask me questions, what's the one thing that's going to close our equity gap? Or when I was working in education especially, give me the one thing to close the opportunity gap. And I always said, I'll give you the one thing to close these gaps when you give me the one ingredient to bake a cake. It's a recipe. That being said, I want to ask you for one thing, and it's not the one thing that's solving everything. I'm not asking you that question because it's the wrong question, I believe. But give me an example of something that you're working on now that you think is working, especially. I'm going to throw one of my pet ones in. We've got a talent shortage, and we have incredible diversity in our diversity when companies need globally fluent people. So we've started Connect, MSP, which is an alumni database and social network for the 28,000 young people who've been in Step Up and those in College Possible and Right Track, and others. So we now actually have a feeder system with Greater MSP and Itasca that can connect all of this pipeline of young people who are now in the workforce with all of the great companies. Give me just one thing that's not solving everything, but solving a piece of this puzzle.
You know, one big thing is for the Met Council is we have the largest construction project in the history of Minnesota that is starting next month, which is the Southwest Light Rail. And so that is, of course, a huge deal, and we have to look at how we're contracting on that, right? So one thing is we have federal prevailing wage, so we have that there, but we're really working on something called MCUB, the Metropolitan Council Underutilized Businesses. So we're really working to make sure that we're getting the underutilized businesses for everything, for the subcontractors on the line, for all those contracts that come along, because it's about a $2 billion project, and that's where we're making the investments, making sure it happens. We have an equity advisory committee at the Met Council that is helping us, make decisions like that, looking at issues like that, as well as the new council that Governor Walz appointed. It was great to see him here this morning. Is 50% people of color. So we're, overall, we're changing, and we're trying to change the way we're doing business.
So just to set you up on this, Janis, let's think about what Nora just said. In the last biggest project, hit a record participation of businesses of color, not because politicians put a high bar on it, which we did, but because places like the Minneapolis Foundation came in and did an impact investment where we used part of our resources that have been invested otherwise and invested in businesses of color that we then got paid back and are now loaning back out to people like Meda. So wouldn't that be a great thing for the Minneapolis Foundation and you guys to partner on this project? So it's not like we're doing deals here, guys, but let's do deals. I'm not actually asking you that, but tell us something specific that's working there.
So I'll give you a specific example of a project that we're supporting that I think has been really successful. But I'm going to start with the Dodge, which is, I do think, I appreciate the point of let's get tangible and specific about things that are working. But I think it's important, especially for this room, to think about that silver bullet solutions, like you said, you need a lot of ingredients to make a cake. But I think that we have to grapple with a real danger around silver bullet solutions. They actually paper over our equity challenges. Because when you look for that one-size-fits-all solution, by definition, you're going to leave people out. You're not going to meet people where they are. And I preface that to then say, one of the projects that I'm most proud of that we've had really great success with is our Entrepreneurs of Color funds. Started with a partnership with Kellogg Foundation in Detroit. That particular fund started out as $6 million and now has grown to over $20 million. I think it's at $22 or $24 million now. 80-something entrepreneurs, no defaults. And these are entrepreneurs who've not really been able to, would not qualify for a loan with Chase, for example. We've now replicated that in 5 different places. But what is so special about the fund and the replication is that it's not cookie cutter. That fund doesn't look the same in each one of the 5 locations. It took deep listening in Detroit to understand that, actually what the Entrepreneurs of Color in Detroit were telling us is that it was largely Black contractors that wanted the opportunity to bid on big infrastructure projects. They need a line of credit. That's not a traditional product for a CDFI, so we helped them build it. Going into the South Bronx and setting up the fund there, those entrepreneurs are facing incredible gentrification pressures. They don't have access to commercial real estate space that they can afford. That's a totally different challenge. If we just picked up that solution, it's got a great brand, Entrepreneurs of Color, super easy, and plopped it down in different locations with the same solution that worked really well in Detroit, we would have missed the point. And so it's now, we've invested, where are my numbers? I'm gonna make sure I get them right. $9.5 million invested in 200 small businesses and created and preserved 1,200 jobs in our 5 cities, which is fantastic. But in this room, what I want you guys to know is that each one of these looks a little bit different based on deep listening in the community, because that's how I think we actually get to the equity question that you're asking.
So, RT, you stole mine, which was the investment that the
Please tell us more, though.
that the Minneapolis Foundation made in Meda to provide products and services for contractors on the U.S. Bank Stadium, which was a huge success. But I think the success that we're working on now is in partnership with the other minority business support organizations. So Meda, along with Community Reinvestment Fund, Latino Economic Development, Asian Economic Development, African Development Center, African Development Solutions, have formed a group called Catalyst. And we've done an analysis of the needs of minority businesses. There are currently $60 million in deals that we could make that we don't have capital for today that actually would accelerate the shrinking of the gap for people of color in the Twin Cities. So we've banded together to think about how do we create a system that works for the entrepreneur, that is a one-stop place where that entrepreneur goes in and doesn't have to figure out who they are going to work with, how they're going to work with them, et cetera, but they actually get to the place they need to go, and they also get the services that they need, whether it's capital, whether it's access to education, whether it's access to markets. We're also working with some of our corporate partners to think about what is the anchor institution strategy so that they can carve out part of their spend so that when entrepreneurs of color actually are ready, that they can actually get those contracts so that we can accelerate both jobs and opportunity. People of color actually hire more people of color than anyone else in this market. So the question of who's creating the jobs, where are those jobs coming from, really have to come from that base, in part because even as a child where I grew up in a segregated place, we are still a very segregated place. And so part of what we need to be able to do is build the infrastructure for that to happen. And I am so proud to work with these partners because we're all interested in increasing access for these businesses to do well in our economy. This is it's not the only thing that needs to happen, but if it doesn't happen, we're not going to be able to get there from here. So that's what we're working on.
Great.
I would say one thing that we hope can make a big difference in this space, but needs to get passed through the legislature these next 3 weeks, is something called the Minnesota Innovation Collaborative. And it's a program we put together in discussion with a lot of other leaders in the community, inspired by much of the work that Gary and others have done to help entrepreneurs make their ideas into businesses, which says the state government should be more involved in making it feel less risky to start a business and helping communities who might not otherwise take that risk or have access to learn how to make a business get resources to do that. So there's a series of incentives around making it easier to leave a comfortable job and build a startup. For example, free health insurance for a year if you're going to take that kind of a risk to make it seem a bit more doable. And then a whole series of statewide education efforts focused really on greater Minnesota and targeted communities who could use some help on the education front about how to take an idea, usually a tech-based idea, and make it into a startup. So how to build a business plan, how to build a technology team, how to build an early sort of idea and test it and iterate on it and grow it. And I think what we hear from startups across the state is that that's some of the hardest parts about starting a business, but we want to make it such that you don't got to be a college student living in Dinkytown and who already has a network of startup sort of friends and venture capitalist connections to take your idea and make it into reality. So this Minnesota Innovation Collaborative, we hope, will make it possible for anybody in the state with a great idea to turn it into a startup and grow that business. And really want to make sure that target communities in particular are ones that we grow our efforts with. So it's not a reality yet, but that's one idea we hope we can bring across the finish line this session.
Excellent. I'm going to ask a final question, and I'm going to make it hard. And also, Steve has to get another appointment. So you answer, and I won't let you up. I'll answer, so I'll ask a quick question. We wouldn't be in this mess if people were doing more disruptive thinking earlier. So I want to ask you something that may be controversial in this room. Tell us something that is disruptive, that may be controversial now, but shouldn't work. I'll model this. I think it is incredibly important for us to not allow gentrification that moves people out of the neighborhoods they built. At the same time, I believe this deep focus on that has lost track of homeowners of color who lost an enormous amount of equity in 2008 and when the economy collapsed. So we also have to look at strategies that help them build equity back up in their house. That's complicated, but it is a layer that's important because small business startups are critical, and college education for your kids are tied up with the equity in your home. That's pretty complicated within this whole issue of rightfully talking about gentrification. So I've made myself enemies on Twitter. Anybody else want to jump in?
Sure. Why not make myself some enemies on Twitter? No, I would say, look, one area that I think has some controversy that is overblown and shouldn't is how we as a state and how we as a country invest in opportunity zones, which is, many of you in this room know, are these specifically designed census tracts for which venture capital can come into at a discounted rate to help investors who are sitting on top of large capital gains put money into improving communities. And I think there's a controversy in some communities that capital won't come in with the right impact in mind, and that we need to be careful about some of the effects that it will have on the communities, which is of course true, but I think it's a mistake to look away from that kind of opportunity to grow our economy in the state. And so I think that's one area where it's a new disruptive idea. It's a part of Trump's tax plan, so most people might think, oh, it's from the wrong direction, but in fact, it's kind of one of the good things, in my opinion, that came out of that plan and can help invest in communities across the state. And Minnesota could probably do more to make our opportunity zones more effective. And I know Lisk and others who are here today are doing a lot of really thoughtful thinking on that, and I think we indeed look forward to working more with them to make sure we can make that program work for the state.
Steve's going to sneak off. Please give him a round of applause and thank him. Okay, Gary, let her rip.
So I get accused of having a lot of ideas. So when you said that, I said, well, there's several.
Good.
I think mine isn't revolutionary in the sense that it should be shocking. But if we did it, I think we would make progress. I think everybody in this room, how many of you want to make progress on the issues we're talking about today? Please raise your hand. How many of you are tired of talking about it but want to see something happen? Please raise your hand. So we need a sense of urgency that I'm not sure exists within the body politic or in the community at large around how we solve these issues. I say that's number one. I say number two is anything that I've been able to get done, I've had a plan, right? And then I have actual real metrics, and then I get actually judged against those metrics for whether we're going to make progress or not. So this isn't rocket science. But I think we've done a lot of measuring, we've done a lot of analysis. We have analysis by paralysis of the issues that we're dealing with. But unless we get serious about holding each other accountable and the system accountable about actually achieving something. So how would we know sitting in the room today that we've made progress on the issue of the racial wealth divide or equity, et cetera? We have a lot of scorecards. But who gets held accountable for that? If I was running Meda like that, I probably wouldn't have a job. And if any of you were doing what you do, you wouldn't have a job. So I don't think it's radical. I think it actually is tried and true. Set up a plan, measure against that plan, put some resources and investment in, and then hold people accountable and organizations accountable for getting there. And if they don't achieve that, then they need to go out of business or get another line of business that they can be successful at. But in this situation here in the Twin Cities, we haven't been able to do that, and I'm so sad about that.
Cool. Good. Thank you.
So I don't know if this is radical, but I'll say where I think I want to see us push a little bit more, and maybe this is useful to you all as well. But increasingly, I want to make sure that we're bringing intersectionality into our work and our perspective on equity. And I mentioned the learning journey that we were on in terms of thinking about innovation within each one of our drivers of economic opportunity, and now advancing cities kind of looking at the the intersections. I think often in the equity space we can get quite binary in how we talk about this. We talk about black and white, maybe we talk about black, white, Hispanic. We don't always talk about a gender lens within that, and then we really lose, then we fade out. There's like some mumbling on the side about LGBT, people with disabilities, immigration status. And I think we need to have a bigger conversation about all of those things together, and for a couple of reasons. One is because I think when you solve for the most vulnerable and work your way up, that's when you're going to see solutions with the greatest impact. But also because I think these are interlocking puzzle pieces where you can't actually solve one without addressing the other. And to my earlier point, if you're just going for silver bullet solutions, then you won't actually get to those communities that are the most vulnerable. I don't think it's helpful to have solutions and approaches that are so bespoke, they work for 5 people. But I also think that if we're not measuring, if we're not going back and looking at the data and unpacking the way that race and gender and sexual orientation and immigration status all play on each other, we might not actually get to the heart of some of the issues we're trying to tackle.
I don't know about disruptive, but one aha moment was I should be working with Gary a lot closer, right?
Yes.
Especially when I talk about Southwest Light Rail. And also we passed ships on the night at the Met Council. He just came off the Met Council when I was coming on. And so, 2 quick things.
It is not controversial to say you want to work with Gary Cunningham, because everybody does.
No,
No fair.
I should be working with him. And one thing, I guess 2 just quick things is we have the Livable Communities grants. And so one thing the Met Council can do even more is push those out, because, for example, in Maplewood when I was mayor, is we were able to do financing, and it allows people of color of all ranges of incomes to do projects. And in our case, we did homeless vet credits, right? And that was very close to where I lived. It was, considered somewhat innovative, maybe a little controversial, but what an amazing project it brought to our city. And then the other part, which some of you, if you're from cities, might find controversial, but is the comp plans, and that's where we have the rules and regulations, but we're trying to push that envelope of affordable housing, transportation, planning. It's regional planning in our area. Each city has to come up with a plan, probably in most areas every 10 years, but we need to push that, right? And it's really interesting to see what Minneapolis did, if you've seen their plan, to see what people are doing. I went to the GARE conference recently, and there's Minneapolis and St. Paul are kind of the stars of the program, and I have to go to another state to hear more about that. So I would say we're supporting the region, trying to push the envelope and make us the best region possible when it comes to equity.
Great. Just a quick idea. The Met Council has park and rides around the entire metropolitan area that are surface parking lots. And wouldn't it be wonderful if affordable inclusive housing was built on each one of those, so to be transit-oriented development, and would locate affordable housing in every neighborhood? We could all park around it.
I like that idea.
Please thank our panel, I think.